Hello everyone, today we talk about Christian education during the early Middle Ages. So recently I discussed about very similar topics, especially for what it concerned written culture and manuscript tradition in early medieval times in West, chiefly. Made also other videos about the relation between classical knowledge and Christian culture, especially during the late antique. You're going to find most of these things in either the medieval society or medieval Christianity playlists. This is today we will essentially look at how Christian education kind of shaped itself throughout these centuries. So it actually goes along with a pair of videos I made just recently that are respectively literary production in early medieval Europe, 6th, 11th century, and literacy in early medieval Europe. Those can be interesting because they give you an extra background if you're interested, I don't know, if you have time to spend, let's say, but it's important, sometimes these videos seem about certain topics seem to be very all alike, but telling the truth, it's just the same thing but watched from different perspectives. So today we're mostly going to stick to how teaching was practically carried out and in which centers and how what was aimed at. Because what I would love personally to make you understand true Schwerpunkt, if you already don't know it, or you've never thought about it, or maybe you have another opinion, of course. At least I would like to offer you this opinion of mine. It is, however, the most prevalent in academy today, because that's how we basically deal with history now. At this point of historiography, historiographical development is essentially you don't have to look at this as as a sort of regression, as a sort of negative event, as if these new forms of education were somewhat the cause of more ignorance and stuff like that. Many people still think the Middle Ages in these terms, which is a shame for reasons that I've now been extensively discussing on Schwerpunkt, but never quite addressed in a single video, about the prejudices that we have about the Middle Ages. The misfortune is these prejudices are so deeply rooted, especially I think I see our Western world is still incredibly backwards under this point. I mean, considering that it's the more advanced, even historiographically speaking, it's sometimes really disturbing to see how people completely are out of touch from these concepts, and like the Middle Ages are just treated like a dark hole where nothing happened, where everything was inherently worse than other periods. At least the one that preceded and followed them immediately. Just recently I made another video that maybe discusses also a bit of this, that is periodizing the Middle Ages, in which I make several considerations about how we think the Middle Ages objectively, and how it doesn't make sense even to think of the Middle Ages as such, because quite obviously the Middle Ages never existed. And how we still suffer those prejudices. But in terms of education, also there is this, and I addressed it also so many times now. I mean, this idea that culture would be, this epiphenomenal form of education is somehow conceived as in very modernistic ways. In our modern thinking is very, very influenced by the Enlightenment, for which basically if we don't have a scientific categorization of reality that takes into consideration also just pure, sheer facts and evidence, and it's not education, it's not useful, it's backwards, it's regressive, and all this stuff. When you look at history, every time, actually, including the Enlightenment and even beyond, it's not a point now of a specific time. You have probably the most important phase to understand that education is something that has chiefly a pragmatic intent. Naturally, this has a lot to do also with which kind of society you're dealing with, because, for instance, we will see now how in early medieval times, in spite of all the difficulties that existed from an environmental point of view, there was still an effort to extend education to certain strata of the population you would not expect, even in the countryside. Naturally, this didn't change a big much. But, if you take even other periods, you realize that maybe the top of education, like if you take humanism, for instance, it was actually pretty elitary. It corresponded to other dynamics. It's paradoxical how in the so-called Dark Ages, this moment in which between depends, because also the early medieval times start in different places in different times, but let's say roughly this moment of maximum contraction of demic and economical contraction, how you see it. Paradoxically, there was perhaps a higher degree of education that there would be in later times, on average, on the population, especially after Carolingian times, because after Carolingian times, society gets more stratified. So paradoxically, although there is a progress that starts occurring at other levels, chiefly the demic, in fact, an economical one, you see that people, that literacy falls again. So you can't always trace, you have to understand many factors, and especially understand that education is, the product of the society that exists. And often this society evolves for causes that are not really dictated by moral problems. There are, it's very easy to stick to this kind of macrostructural reasons like, climate change and so on. I personally don't buy that fully, because there's been a period in historiography in which we have started reconsidering the fact that we can't interpret all the major changes occurred into history, the little the glaciations, for instance, that to explain certain economical contractions. Of course, they were important. Of course, we have evidence of such climate change, but there are objectively other dynamics. They're political, social, and they're all one, actually, because the system, as complicated as it is all interconnected. So it's very difficult, also historically speaking, to say, okay, this is where the thing began or stopped, and this was the reason. And the point is, in my opinion, that society changes in ways that are not controllable by society, even in such more simple society that our own, like the early medieval one, could really be. So when you look at education, you often and many other things, including that have to do also with written production, such as jurisdiction, production of laws, and so on, you realize that such measures are usually, you can't take it as a general rule, at least this is how I do it, they're usually taken as quite pragmatical and actually very functional measures. That is, you need essentially something to be done. At this point, there was nothing like a mandatory education. There was no there was no strict, intense, direct control on such on the populations. On the contrary, early medieval times are a moment of greater, decentralization in part, or at least where the statal systems of Latin Germanic Europe are rather weak, and they evolve very, very slowly, also chiefly along the development, in parallel with the development of the ecclesiastical structures. But the point I'm making, I guess, is that this made what you find in there, a much more pragmatic thing that, let's say, in terms of education, that what and effective and productive than what it was, during humanism. That instead is, sung as this moment of enormous development for which, and it was also very progressive as well, and it was also like 90% a philological thing, not really a scientific one. So, and I'm being generous with the percentage. And so, let's try to look at this world without putting, ourselves these limits, this preconceived, these preconceptions for which, this was a dark time. and everything sucked, and everything was bad, and everything was ruined by. And it's weird because such prejudices are actually stressed also by people who allegedly like the Middle Ages, because maybe they like this roughness that exists. I mean, as if in other in other times it didn't exist. And not looking at society as a whole. Many people are just passionate about bloodsheds and military history, just like me, by the way, because that's what I do as a job. But there is much more, and indeed, you have to focus on society at every, in every aspect if you really want to understand those times. So, premise over premise. Let's try to start. So, as we have said before, it was a great progressivity in how this transformations, this passage from late antique culture and early medieval culture practically occurred. Sometimes it's not even very clearly distinguishable. We also don't know excessively much, honestly, about these times, so we have to rely on a very few set of sources that kind of tell us enough, let's say, to understand certain things that are pretty omnicomprehensive. So roughly by the 5th century, in West still existed those few lay schools that basically were they represented a bit the depositories of the cultural legacy of the classical past. So a classical past that already here was not exactly the same as it was already strongly mediated by Christianism, as it basically at this point the empire was officially Catholic, and also, albeit certain regions of the West kind of maintain more this, especially in the senatorial elites, so also the ones who were best educated, this greater, classicism in its intent, and also, certain relics of paganism in practice, in life. I mean, this was a moment of great hybrid. The majority of the teaching, the classical sources were being lost. By the 5th century, would have been quite difficult to ask a person who Cicero had been and actually knowing that. Also in here, it was mostly a social problem, because because people didn't need to study anymore. There had to be we don't have to magnify excessively Roman standards of education, as if in Roman times everybody was educated or literate and so on. There are naturally certain impressive data we have. There are certain estimates. I think, I don't know, in Antonine times, like 70% of male freemen were educated in the Roman Empire. Something like they were literate, but also being literate can mean several different things. I mean, one thing is just knowing how to write your name or how to read something. Another thing is being a person who has a common and direct practice with books and writing and so on, which is very different, and that had been very rare also in previous times, albeit not so rare, but it was unusual at least, and simply the majority of the population lived in other ways. We also forget that the majority of the Roman Empire was made up by the countryside, not by the cities, not just in in terms of economy, which practical, how many people lived in there, academically speaking. And in these lay schools that still exist in the 5th century, you realize that classical culture was surviving in ways that showed you how elitary it was. Very often these schools were present actually in very even difficult to call them schools. I mean, surely there were schools scattered, but most of this classical legacy was related to also a lot of oratory activities, of public readings. Public speeches were usually performed into these large libraries of the the ancient world, that at this time were empty, they were falling apart, and certain authors of this age practically state this, there are very few people in there, you don't hear them anymore. So this also entails that it's as if this moment of passage was felt. It was definitely felt. Although this decline, how they pictured it, was naturally also the decline seen from usually from the senatorial perspective, the only one that that basically produced such sources. Maybe the average no one that lived in cities, even like Rome, etc., at this point didn't probably even care, because it was used from generations and generations not to go hear people talking and making all these refined, sophisticated speeches. Ultimately, for what? People had to work. Life was not easy. Economy was slowly regressing. So even though this world by the 5th century was actually still pretty active, late antique culture was still relatively dynamic. This elements of transition were evident and were being stressed, at least by a certain part of the cultural elite that saw this as a major, not just as a cultural decline, but also together with it as a civic decline, because objectively also Roman education was very often thought, the oratory, rhetorics, and so on were conceived for actually for civil activities, like speaking in tribunals, making these orations in the Senate, and so on. So it was all very proper of this senatorial class that had so much reason also to talk to the people, to influence its clienteles, also for mere political reasons. So the ancient world had been, at least the Hellenistic and the Roman world, had been gravitating about this idea, that education came together with political commitment. So this was felt as a decline of many ways, and without making any kind of biased remark, but it was the same senatorial elite, however, that at this point was kind of withdrawing from that model, because now the cities were becoming less profitable, economically speaking, to control. They were also the favorite target of the barbarian invasions and so on. So there is this withdrawal that actually I find very pragmatic, and I'm not stigmatizing it, to the countryside. To the countryside, where the Romans mentally had always remained. From a cultural point of view, think about the otium, or otium if you prefer the ecclesiastical pronunciation. I mean, this idea of of a sort of intellectual retirement into the countryside, into the country villas, that at this time incidentally were being in fact revived a lot, because also as administrative centers, because that's where the senatorial elite was slowly moving from the city, because it was safer, it was more profitable. They could also control from there more directly their sources of income. If you're interested about this, I made a couple of videos. One could be Transformation of the West, 3rd, 6th century. Another one was the one about from the late antique villa to the early medieval curtis. That's also relatively, important as a topic in this sense, because it shows you how there was this readaptation substantially of the ancient world to something different, that also put the base for what we think to have been a ideally medieval system, and that shows you actually the similarity in part of these two worlds, and how there was how ideological it is even to conceive the ancient world or the medieval world, because objectively, even from a sheer structural point of view, the base was always the same as a pre-industrial society. Here everything that we see is mostly, this is also a problem of sources, because we mostly see what was shifting at the top, but at the base things were much more idling over the centuries than we can imagine. We are polarized, our attention is polarized by this mostly, kind of the elite that is always the one that objectively represents a more altered world than the one it really is in some way, and that and it is also more directly we tend to be more sympathetic with literary speaking, because obviously these people wrote. If a peasant cannot write, what can you find about him? You can find some archaeological data, but not so much. Instead, from this late antique elite, we have a voice, for instance. So we are kind of more polarized towards that elite, its urban environment. So what represented a little bit the surplus of the tip of an iceberg that otherwise was much wider, much less different in its parts, and also from what would transform into later. As is mostly the top that changed in practice. And the this kind of education basically came to an end with roughly with the fall of the West, we can say, brutally speaking, by stressing, of course, that how even after the canonical 476 AD, actually late antique culture survived, but was slowly also here transitioning towards something different. Sorry. So also in this process, the also schools basically underwent a sort of collapse. These lay schools especially, and the amount of greater the real watershed, especially these schools had remained mostly in Italy and in Gaul, because these were actually the most important cultural centers in the West. This kind of evolved in different ways, and at least in the Italian peninsula, the great watershed, the greatest moment of collapse is the so-called Greek-Gothic War, that really brought a very violent end to many things, actually to certain cities in itself. Thinking about even Rome. Rome was, at a certain point during the war, was completely abandoned. In southern Gaul, things kind of remained a bit more. I mean, if you look at the 6th century, and there is more continuity in some way. And this also because Gaul didn't get destroyed practically by of course it had suffered invasions, pillaging, and so on, devastations, but it had more or less structurally remained the same, especially southern Gaul. In fact, southern Gaul at this point was arguably the most culturally advanced country in the West. But this, however, lay education was collapsing also there, and when we find this new what was remaining and this culture that still existed, we're talking mostly about Christian culture. In fact, Christian schools had remained standing, simply because the church at this point was not collapsing. It surely suffered heavy blows during certain events. I mean, we see that also through the history of the dioceses, that devastations could hit very hard, that many dioceses even disappeared at a certain point. Also because these dioceses are not to be meant as a strictly ecclesiastical thing. I mean, the diocese, aside from being actually a province of the empire at this point, was also the community revolving around that diocese, that bishop. So if you see that at a certain point, I don't know, the gods arrive and during the war and they destroy a certain place, and you don't have evidence of that diocese existing anymore, first of all, can't be sure, but that's still a pretty important, especially if you find this over and over again, structurally speaking, widespread as a phenomenon, that there's been a collapse, a contraction, maybe that community doesn't exist anymore, or has undergone, however, a terrible, let's say, reshaping. Also changing physically residents, because this is also happened very often, that certain centers were abandoned in favor of others, maybe that were not even so far away, but they were maybe on a higher ground, and they were safer, also were more suitable for this reduced population now. So many transformations that into which, however, the church, in a way or another, survived. The church at this point was extremely resilient. We will see also during the time of the second invasions that, in spite of all the destructions that the Vikings, the Saracens and the Magyars carried out against Christian monasteries that were at that point the centers of European culture, these monasteries kind of lived on. That the communities were able to reform, to re-put the monastery in shape. So the church at this point was much more than just a spiritual thing. It was actually a very strong political and social actor in here, and it was essentially the authority that had substituted to the imperial rule when the public authority had vanished in some way. So people actually depended on the local bishops, as these bishops, by the way, were drawn usually from the same senatorial elite that had transformed itself, had changed face, sometimes also very cleverly, because among the senators there were also some of the last and more convinced pagans who believed that Christianity had been essentially a negative thing for the empire, that, however, understanding how the situation where they also transform into something else, becoming bishops and remaining with all their power and so on. Especially Gallic bishops at this time were extremely powerful, so they had their own military retinues. So it was a society that was maybe changing face, but not really the substance, with this elite still controlling, and with the only difference that objectively there was a state that was collapsing or had already vanished in some areas of Europe, and that left these local powers to basically deal with things on their own. Also, bishops were the privileged interlocutors for the Germanic invaders, who had, in spite of the contrasts that naturally existed between, especially Catholics and Arians and so on, however, had always to rely in a way or another on the ecclesiastical hierarchy, because in order to govern these ex-Roman countries in the West, because those were the guys who practically ruled in there. And the Germans might have had their own armies and so on, but they couldn't control the whole area without a whole region, let's say, without the support of the local population, were normally much larger than them and uncontrollable otherwise. And that's why practically all the Arians converted to Catholicism eventually in the West. If you look at the history of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, that's how it went. And sometimes it was not even such a conflictual thing as it's usually depicted. Actually, it was well, okay, maybe now we don't have time to go in depth, to digress. The Christian schools of this time, so in this moment of transition, let's say we are already in after 476, they weren't new, they hadn't been created now, they already existed, and they were aimed essentially at training the priests, especially in the secondary education. This is important because albeit surely, the majority of the clergy was relatively still well educated at this time. Um, Given that Christianity also was only very slowly spreading towards the north of Europe, the central north of Europe. So usually the majority of the clergy at this point came from the Mediterranean still. So in places where latent culture was still surviving in part and where they were educated. But so we can imagine there were ways these people got literate in some way, but they weren't requested, an enormous amount of knowledge after all. For the higher echelons of the church, like for the bishops, etc., it had been needed, however, exactly for this political and administrative commitment that the church had at this point, had to be educated in a consistent way, with a sort of like going to a university. Naturally, this was much more modest. Also, bishops at this point were, highly educated, but for those standards, they weren't dramatically cultured. Aside from certain exceptions, naturally, they were extremely, they had in this encyclopedical mind, but we remember them chiefly because they were unique, in fact, in this sense. But this is also part of what I was saying before, meaning that it's not that things had gotten worse because of this new form of education, but simply it was new form of education was adapting to more pragmatic problems that were definitely, let's say, more pressing. Like administration also required a great deal, not just of of literacy. It also required cooperation, certain relations also with communities and so on. So also the strict need of a mere intellectuals were not always the only necessary thing. However, also the landscape in here the scenario was pretty varied in many ways. What is interesting though is that in this collapse of the public school system of the Roman times, the laymen were increasingly in need for education, and they ended up to go studying into these ecclesiastical schools, so that such centers of learning were not just designed for the clergy, but also for laymen. As we were saying before, these schools were mostly for a elementary teaching most of the times. Only the more gifted people, individuals, went beyond for certain to study in a career. And this is how actually the same Roman education had been. Students were not meant to have all the same education. Only the ones who were deemed to be more gifted kind of went on. The others stopped to elementary education. So it still was practically also in these ecclesiastical schools. So the interesting part of this is that the church didn't limit itself to merely collect a legacy. So basically assuming the task that up to the 5th century had carried out the empire in terms of education. At this point, the church, which is not an easy thing to do in the first place, because obviously the church and the state were, in spite of all the intersections that we have seen now, there were still two very different things. And now also, it's not that the state had completely vanished in the air, for which there was just the church. Now the Germans had arrived, and they were essentially trying to build another state on their own, but with very different bases, and in fact needing so much the help of the church. There was the literate, for instance, as the Germans weren't. So there was this also great work of integration, of assimilation, of cultural mediation, of political mediation as well. So it was already very difficult very difficult. It was natural in some ways, but it also had different aims. I mean, for the church to practically collect the classical legacy. It was a great work of mediation. Also, many classical works had been excluded by this. I mean, as we have seen in other videos, that there was essentially a corpus of not more than 150 works that were available during the early medieval times. Even in the brightest case, if anybody had practically read all of them, that was it. That was the limit, the capacity, because certain classical works had not been deemed to be interesting, so they were not preserved. They were not even actually destroyed. Were simply left, to rot somewhere, and simply because, I don't know, if a father of the church had not deemed that work to be interesting, nobody, the Christian in this sense was not, the Christian scribe was not interested in copying it or reading it. So sometimes we even have only certain parts of a classical work, because that's only the part in which the father of the church had commented, and rest had been forgotten and remained in the oblivion. So naturally, sometimes we have been lucky enough to find also other pieces of work, thinking about Pompeii, for instance, where they were found of not Pompeii, but Herculanus, I think, where they found all these ancient manuscripts, from actually the 1st century AD. But that's an extraordinary evidence. Almost practically all what we have from ancient times in terms of written of literature and other works, historiography, and so on. It's from the mediation, the Christian mediation, and the transcriptions that also were carried out during the early Middle Ages. But beyond this, we must say that the Church had not just stopped to the passive copy of these works. They had also assimilated it, also during the late antique period. I mean, ever since basically the Christians were allowed since the 4th century to get educated, to have a career, to enter also in this state administration. So to get educated at a consistent level, they had been always drinking at the classical spring, always. There's never been in history a single time in which a Christian library had exclusively Christian works. There were always classical works, and that's how our Christian society in the West has always been. Always looking at the past, always looking at the ancient world, always looking at the Greeks, the Romans, and what they had done, because that was deemed to be important. Christ, after all, had been born into the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire now was Christian, so there was an evident need to look at that history and say, okay, let's see what we can assimilate from that. Why is that Seneca, for instance, had such a great fortune? Because in certain traits of Stoicism and other elements was seen in part some Christian virtue. So even certain classical authors were considered as crypto-Christians by these standards, because the Christians had made this effort to essentially save the good that they had found according to their standards into those works. So there was a great process of elaboration also, that after the final collapse of the classical world now brought the Church, as we were saying, not to merely passively hand down the works to the generations, but also to elaborate a new and autonomous cultural policy. And this was not merely just, in fact, intellectual. You can argue that intellectualism, by as it had been known in the Roman elites, there's also this kind of elitism for which, who was educated was a dominus, was a master, and who had slaves and who ruled society. This kind of came to an end for many reasons, because naturally the most educated were still usually some of the most powerful. I mean, this is not maybe so evident, in fact, when you realize that also the the elites in the early medieval times were not definitely that educated. But through the senatorial elite, through the new nobility that was formed at this point from the fusion between the Germanic chieftains and the senatorial class, the Romanized senatorial class, you realize that something had survived also from that point of view. That definitely the existence of lords, even before feudalism in this early medieval times, still entailed in part, especially in those countries like Gaul, especially Gaul, also in parts Spain. In Italy, especially with the Longobards, it becomes a bit more difficult, but still, this idea that there is an elite. However, the cultural elite, as we have seen, was mostly embodied by the clergy. That was all one with the senatorial class in some ways, but sometimes not so much, especially in certain areas. For instance, Italy is so important because that's where the senatorial elite got wiped out, in part, especially in the Lombard-ruled areas, but also in the Byzantine areas. There had been a contraction for which the clergy had also, the monastic experiences had a greater importance than maybe just the urban one. Think about Saint Benedict, for instance. So also here, I don't want to digress, but probably the most important thing now was that for the first time, arguably, at least as a full, precise intent of cultural, of planned education, let's say, the education was tried to be extended to other strata of the population that usually had not been at all educated, and this passed through not much the need of the need of education in for the sake of it, but through the need of evangelization. The evangelization of the European countries, it's a very big topic. Also, maybe we'll discuss it in other times, on another occasion. But it entailed a process of acculturation of certain areas that had, during Roman times, even under Roman times, had not been literate. This is important because, as we were saying before, Roman education had been mostly an illiterate thing at a, can't say better. Urban people were educated. The world of city was dynamic. The world of city was, literate, and it was a great practice. But the countryside had never been. There had been surely some form of education had managed to penetrate, but what you realize in vast areas of the Roman Empire, nobody had even been practically Romanized. This is also another point. There were areas like in Spain or in Gaul or in Britain that had remained under the Roman rule for like half of a millennium, and still had remained basically untouched by the Romanization. So this is something that changes during early medieval times, because Christianity for the first time starts saying, okay, we have to expand also in the countryside. We need to basically Christianize everybody, and this could come through a process that was very complex, because it's not that the Christians now wanted to literally educate every single peasant to make him read the Bible. Obviously, this is not true, and this was unfeasible and impractical, and it was never achieved. But it entailed a new form of administrative organization that necessarily required at least the rural parsons, parish priests, so you want to call them, to be educated. Even in this tiny, and lost and isolated areas of the Western European countryside. That was also rather wild at this point. Also the decline of the Roman Empire had brought to even strictly environmental. Thinking about infrastructures that collapsed, also the nature that took over once again certain areas. Certain areas came back to be flooded because the systems of bonification were not maintained. So it was a world that was also pretty dangerous. So naturally, through our geography, we also have the history when these Christian missionaries went trying to evangelize the pagans, were martyrized and so on. So it was a world, was a desolated world in many ways, and it was perceived as such at the time as well. Interestingly enough, if you study Christian geography, you see that there are so many beautiful hints. If you read, beyond if you beyond the apparent meaning, you find so many hints and details and information about this world. It was largely rural, very primitive, very simple, very rudimentary, and if you see the Benedictine rule, that's basically it. These monasteries were just huts at the beginning. They weren't anything like these monks had to work all the time because they had to survive. And also the idea of food, the idea of the miracle of the precious resource that God helps you to seize. Shows you this world of poverty. That, however, was in this sense very open to accepting the Christian message, because also around the monastic communities there was instead an organization, a sort of economical revival of the monasteries became the centers of the local life, the rural life, and this is also true. The process through certain areas that had remained pagan through that time kind of began to interact with the Christians and got eventually evangelized. Maybe just still believing in the old agrarian traditions and rites and religion even that they had for millennia, but also beginning to integrate this Christian worldview that eventually was the one that they would remain framed in. So and this is important because this process was also rather slow, but it was nevertheless rationalized and systematized, I don't know how to say this, by certain councils. Probably the most important one is the Council of Vaison in 529. The council established substantially that rural parish priests had the duty to accept, to embrace, to receive substantially every lector, that is essentially those who had to learn, to teach them how to read the Psalterium, that is the book of the Psalms, for instance, and also other parts naturally of the Bible. So this council was very important actually, because it it entailed a new scholastic organization that didn't accept just the future, the would-be clergy essentially, but also those who simply, all of those who wanted to accept, they wanted and could learn to how to read and to write. So this was the moment, probably one of the most important moments into which this new Christian schools entered into the replaced essentially the disappeared municipal Roman schools, and would make up together with those schools that would be created into the monasteries, the basic school structure into those areas of Western Europe where, however, the written culture was more widespread. So this also entailed in part a cooperation with the local communities, for which also these young were usually young men who were sent to be educated, were in this sense also pushed by the church to be educated also at home by their fathers, for instance, to study the holy text and the basically educate them in the law of the Lord. And it was contemplated, by the way, that these people would remain, in fact, laymen, because theoretically, Christianity wanted everybody to join essentially in this new Jerusalem, this celestial Jerusalem, in a world that also, this was conceived, especially also by the monasteries. The idea that the Christian society had to expand into this monastic model all over the world, so that the monastery was not just a place where people went to isolate themselves from the world, but first of all, it was a social model that had to be emulated, so that everybody basically could have joined that and expanding into the world, because there is not such an easy relation between the ecclesiastical world and the public world. Eventually society came to this compromise. It was pretty pragmatic, pretty natural, for which, the idea of the coexistence of church and state kind of, was accepted. But in terms of, especially from the monastical point of view, there were more strictly radical experiences that, especially those that had been brought from the eastern provinces. Monasticism had been born in there, that however refused essentially every form of secular life, also in terms of the family and so on. So it's sometimes also very, kind of, you say, but how could this really work? Because indeed the first monastic experiences were something extremely radical. Were extremely also tied to this Eastern tradition of, humiliation, mortification of the flesh. This idea that, in perspective, also appear to be quite disturbing. These branches of spiritual experiences that continued actually throughout the whole Middle Ages, but they kind of reappeared, especially in moments of greater dynamism and tension, especially with the 12th century and so on. But let's say that the church that was created eventually into the West was a bit more pragmatic, a bit more social, a bit more if you want, amenable, compliant, but not in a negative sense, meaning that it was better at that point. It was felt evidently the need to also to reorganize the secular society through the help of the church, because at that point, working in different directions didn't help anyone, and there were so many points in common at that point, because society was growing to be so much more egalitarian, meaning they were all poorer. Think about the great devastations, the Justinian's pandemics, how this world really was. I mean, the ancient world had represented an extremely stratified world, but there was an elite and many people who were essentially down. Nowadays, social differences were basically vanishing. Everybody was more or less the same. Being rich was there. There was always an oligarchy, there was always an aristocracy, but it was much poorer, much less powerful, much more rooted to the local society. So, and for the rest, there were so many needs in common, and also the monastery presented this kind of positive model. The Benedictines really made a lot of civilization during this point, and there is no surprise why did Benedictine rule spread so easily, so fast, so everywhere. That by the 11th century, every single European monk was considering, in the West, was considering itself a Benedictine, because the Benedictine rule had been written from an extremely pragmatical point of view. It was telling you quite plain and simple what to do in a world that was extremely materially poor, was relatively dangerous, wild, and where there had to be some sort of coming together to put things right, to work, because that was. And education was conceived also here as a work. Famous ora et labora in the Benedictine rule. That practically means, even reading, writing, copying, we owe to the Benedictines so much, given that they even, and this is why education in the Middle Ages was so prized, actually, because in this extremely poor world, where with a survival economy, essentially, you have people who practically spend their time even to copy books. They didn't have anything. They had a very few that world even tools for working and so on, but yet they had their tiny library. There was nothing but a closet by this time in the 6th century, but with those Christian and pagan texts which survived on. So this also makes you understand how in proportion, actually, in a world that we deem to be ignorant, to be obscure and so on, actually from a sheer economical point of view, education, culture, manuscripts had a much greater value than it had in proportion, let's say, during humanism. And this is like today. Today we have so much knowledge we can access. We have plenty of it, but nobody cares about it. We give it to it in proportion to much lesser value than those people in the 6th century gave it to it. So this is important, in my opinion, to stress, because it's the proof of how much education instead was felt as important, even as a way to make it through this world, in a way or in another. So, going back to the meaning of the Council of Vaison 529, basically what was hoped and what this measures aimed at was to form a I would say consciously Christian culture. That is first of all, a somewhat literate culture. Also, outside of the urban centers. This is quite important. Outside of the urban centers, something that before had substantially non-existed. So, from the and this was starting essentially from those same dioceses that during imperial times had hosted the lay schools that now were hosting the cathedral schools of the bishops. A key note to this and how this process succeeded, in part, I mean, given the measures and the aims that we have traced before, is the coordination that all this had, and the guidance it had, say, from the Bishop of Rome. So the importance that the popes had in this process that in a world that, as we've seen, was becoming increasingly local, managed to extend an influence that was objectively of continental scale. Between the 6th and the 8th century, the Bishop of Rome affirmed a cultural hegemony, besides just a political authority as well, that contributed in a determinant fashion to the foundation of an ecclesiastical monopolium of writing. This is important because the Roman popes at this time didn't have actually a direct control on Western Christianity. At this time, the idea was also that the Bishop of Rome was, it had this moral prestige and so on. It was formally recognized a bit as the most important bishop, metropolitan in the West. But also, according to canonic law, there was nothing like that there was a hierarchy of the Western Church that had all to that in the matters of local organization of the local dioceses was practically meant to depend completely on Rome. Not at all. There were certain dioceses that were very importantly in competition with Rome. Especially in Spain, and this was cut off by the Arab invasion essentially, but there were several poles, and at this point especially the popes managed to consolidate very strong ties with Britain, the British Islands, and Gallic, say Frankish Gaul. A huge importance is naturally given to the work of Gregory the Great that guided also the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. And what is amazing, as I was saying before, is in spite of all this contraction of the West, it's how the popes managed to extend this spiritual, to control something from Rome, something that was happening in Britain. And we actually have this enormously important source that is the epistolary of Gregory the Great, that is extraordinary in many ways because first of all this is an otherwise very an epoch with a very few amount of documents available, and it's a beautiful epistolary because it contains in fact these directions. Because from Britain, these people wrote to the Pope and sent them messages to say, okay, how do we have to organize this church? How does it have to be? This didn't happen just now with the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. Was also something complex because first of all, it was done by the Irish, then the Romans at this point come back in the local organization, so that the English church also gets this kind of hybrid. Great importance also of the monasteries as political centers and so on. But aside from this, also in Central Europe, there was a great deal of evangelization on the base of this direct control from Rome. And we have the letters that tell us this, and it's amazing because this tells you how strong this bond was, how much effort, how much commitment in a world like this that had to think about many other things at a local level was able to achieve at a continental level. And in these letters, you notice essentially that a big deal of the problem was the necessity perceived by the Pope to make the faithful really understand the divine message through many different forms of language, because it was realized that illiteracy was pretty high, especially among the laymen. So there was the necessity to express the divine word through images and rituals, and this was also a very important process of cultural mediation, because it necessarily required also an understanding of the local traditions. That's a moment of great, I wouldn't say transfiguration, but I'd say that there was a lot of ingenuity in the way such evangelization was practically carried out. It was practically executed, in the sense that also in here there was no even especially in the so-called Dark Ages, also the political authorities of the Romano-Germanic kingdom was pretty low. Before Carolingian times, there was no actual way to impose evangelization physically, with arms, for instance, with political and military means. So what these missionaries did was something they did literally on their own most of the times. They were surely backed by certain political figures. Some of these missionaries had definitely the support and the backing of the even royalty, as we will see in the case of, think about St. Columban. But sometimes they ventured into areas where they had not discovered, they couldn't be backed up, let's say, and they also got martyrized in this process. So it was a largely autonomous work of the church at this point to spread the Christian message, and to try to make these populations that otherwise were so different, because it's not just a matter of belief. It's not because you believe, I don't know, in Wodan that it's really the whole society that is different. It's the fact you can't read. That was the first problem. The religion of the book that necessarily requires some form of written message that has to be delivered, and also for instructing actually local communities, because there was always someone who would join, would accept being Christianized. So the problem there was not just arriving, telling the good word, spreading the good word, and then coming back. It was a problem of creating a church also in there. So there had to be people that had been drawn also locally, that could read the Bible, could understand it. In spite of the results, naturally were meager, because the conditions really were the ones that we have thrown in here. It's still important that there was a minimal headway of Christianity in this direction, and that it passed through the dialogue with local communities. So the reaction was not always violent at all. Most of the times it was, on the contrary, there was a lot of cooperation. As we have seen, by the way, the Christians now were bringing in certain models also of sedentarism, that were represented also by the same monasteries. There weren't meant to be even actual permanent physical places, also because it was usually thought that a monastery was founded where a miracle had happened, so that the area was sacred, This came also with some imposition sometimes. I mean, so the episodes of martyrdom actually occurred mostly when these Christian missionaries tried basically to destroy the local shrines, or trying to essentially take them. This would happen mostly in those regions that were not under control of not formally Christian authorities. But these things happen also naturally in countries like, I don't know, like Gaul, where Christianity had an early spread, but it hadn't reached, as we've seen. It was mostly a urban spread, and through the arteries of the Roman Empire, with roads and cities, but in the countryside it had remained practically not present. So it was a very slow but consistent work, and also pretty continuous, and stubborn also in many ways, so that society now was a bit of an hybrid between paganism and Christianism at the same time. Also because, as we have said many times on Schwerpunkt, paganism in itself doesn't have actually much of a problem integrating Christianism within its own beliefs. It doesn't. It's just what Christianism starts saying, okay, but you have to get rid of all the other gods, that the problem starts, because it's the monotheistic perspective that conceives the polytheistic one. Otherwise, the polytheistic one doesn't even perceive itself as such. They can accept Christ just they accept another pagan god. So it's very complicated, but it's still important that the church managed to basically involve the local communities also into the ecclesiastical life. And this is important, because on the long run, this Christian presence kind of sedimented and consolidated in the local traditions, and it produced so much also cultural hybrids that were useful to eventually also for further evangelization in other periods, chiefly the Carolingian one. And this is the moment, in fact, when the major reorganization of the church, especially in Christian Europe, happens, because more or less the Mediterranean countries maintained a pretty solid Christianization. Even the countryside in the Mediterranean were, especially in the Italian peninsula, were very much tied to the cities, historically speaking. So it's, since also the cities in there kind of survived more intact, and then there was this continuity with the ancient world, you realize that there was never a moment into which Christianity didn't have the base to remain and to be, it never had difficulties to spread. I'm not aware of martyrdoms in Italy, obviously. This happened in Germany, indeed. I mean, I'm talking about the missionaries who went evangelizing these areas. So we see very different scenarios and perspectives in here. It's the 8th century that changes a lot. Not much because of the formulas of education that definitely also changed with the Carolingian Renaissance, but for what actually Carolingian society was exporting from a political and social point of view. As the monasteries and were becoming essentially certain fiefs on their own, the bishoprics were essentially, the dioceses were a mean of control of districtuation of the newly conquered lands, formerly pagan lands, sometimes, just like Saxony, for instance. Because there was a problem really of changing the lifestyle of these people in order to make them accept certain things. It was not just about, say, and it was very difficult. It wasn't so, it took a lot also of mediation, of cultural mediation with the Saxons to make them understand in the first place what the Christian message was about. I think still in the Ottonian times, there was this need for evangelization, making the people understand essentially that there were certain parallelisms, certain analogies were drawn to make the Saxons so this very intensely warlike people to make it understand what Jesus was, for instance. They were made believe essentially that Jesus was a chieftain, like the Germanic chieftain, and that the apostles were his comitatus. In these stories of the Gospels, when, for instance, the Romans come to arrest Jesus, and Saint Peter attacks with a dagger a Roman, one of the guards, and cuts his ear. In these texts that were spread in Saxony, is very intense emphasis on the bloodshedding, on the sword, and this idea that really to making the Saxons really sympathize with these figures, because there was no other way to make them understand. For instance, the idea of a peaceful message was very complicated for a culture, a warlike culture like that one. But progressively, that made a headway. And what I would say is that you can change this only if you also expand in other ways, if you change society. Germany was much more egalitarian, and it was much poorer indeed than places like Gaul, but it still had, in this sense, this base of freemen that were also potentially all people could revolt to the point, so that Carolingian conquest brought to this social certification that didn't do anything but impoverishing this freeman class. And the idea is, you have to change. You have to carry out a social engineering to finally get in full control of these regions. And the Carolingians made it, because objectively Germany was fully integrated into the system. It eventually, even the same Saxony became the center of the renovation of the empire. So it is very important, because this passed through Carolingian times through very different ways than it had happened in the past. Christianization. And there was the founding of great monastic schools at this point, not just of cathedral seats, because cathedral seats now were even founded in these dioceses that were associated to urban centers. Let's say there were certain sedentary settlements that were something very different from which the Saxons, for instance, had been used to. So with a center that was permanent, even built in a certain fashion, the Carolingians invested a lot of money into this, and they so that was a sort of I don't even know how to call it, probably a stronghold. It was a strategical center. Priests in Saxony were also used as essentially as spies to control the allegiance of the local population, to spot this kind of paganism that was not much about the problem of paganism in itself, because let's be honest, most of the people, even the Carolingian Empire, didn't actually understand Christianity. The problem is that in Saxony, not accepting Christianity was just a political stand, not a religious one. It was just saying, you have invaded us, and you have imposed us our, your rules, your rule, your services, our services, and you destroyed our shrines. You have built these Christian churches over them. We're gonna fight. So, as you know, Carolingian rule in Saxony was very, very harsh, but in the end, this eventually won. But there were also the monasteries that were born also in here. If you go in the Carolingian Europe playlist, I made countless videos about how monasteries were essentially used as a patrimonial, good that was used in certain ways, also by the noble families and so on. there were also many monasteries of imperial foundation. The Carolingians founded, but some of them also were of ancient foundation. But especially during Carolingian times, were that this starts to expand all over Europe practically, because before Carolingian times the major centers had been Luxeuil, Sankt Gallen and Bobbio. So these three centers also to show you this kind of Romano-Germanic world. Luxeuil is in France, naturally. Sankt Gallen is in Switzerland, that is Germany at this time. Bobbio in Italy. So essentially this world that had kind of, with great difficulties, with great slowness, but still effectively has managed to make this ecclesiastical structure survive over the centuries and to strengthen it in the process. So interestingly enough, these were all monasteries of Irish tradition, as you know. The Luxeuil, for instance, is a very important center that was the abbey was founded by Saint Columban in the 6th century, and it eventually would become extremely important in the early Middle Ages, and it was sacked both by the Arabs and the Normans between the 8th and 9th century, and also by other feudal lords, actually Christian feudal lords in later times. It was also involved into other wars and so on. Bobbio was indeed also an extremely important center. This was founded by San Columba as well, in 612, and this was particularly important because it was San Columba at this time was very much close with Gregory VII in this process of evangelization and so on, and in a moment that was seeing the transition of the Longobards from from Arianism to Catholicism. There were many international ties to the with the international elites, the papacy, Longobard Kingdom, the Anglo-Saxons, and this was Bobbio was the foundation was allowed to be carried out by Saint Columba, by the Longobard King Agilulf, thanks also to the mediation of his wife Theodoline, that was a Bavarian princess, become Queen of the Longobards. It was very close also. The Bavars had been Catholic before the Longobards, and she wrote to Gregory the Great. So this great, even fully European world at this point, in a world where Europe was so fragmented, you realize that there was still this unity that connected everyone through the medium of the Church of Rome. Sankt Gallen in eastern Switzerland is also this. Actually, it's a city today, and it takes its name from the monastery, the Benedictine monastery that was founded in here in the first half of the 7th century by not by Saint Columba, but however the Irish monk Gallus, and there was a further foundation in the 8th century, and this is a center that developed pretty much also under Carolingian times, and that's also the development of a settlement in there with other people, and it was created as a diocese in the same century. As we've seen in the very first Benedictine monasteries, most of the monks were actually illiterate. Or however, they limited themselves to read the Benedictine rule, the Regula, and Bible, and a very few other religious texts. Really, the early, especially in the 6th century, the Benedictine monasteries had a very few manuscripts. Also because they were extremely costly. So, also in here there were different interpretations of the same rule over time. I mean, considering also how much time had to be dedicated to the studies. Because objectively, the monks, as soon as they got a bit, richer, they tried to stress also this more contemplative life, because obviously there was someone else working for them and they could study more. And so this is how also wealth brings to surplus and people who can get educated and study and so on. However, it's exactly from this Benedictine monasteries that sometimes, as we've seen, were also something structurally very, very modest. And so, however, that in this kind of half asleep early medieval Europe, the new cultural ferments began to emerge. In Carolingian times, especially the cultural politics of the sovereigns started a very important qualitative evolution of the mechanisms of cultural education, and Charlemagne especially insisted on 3 points. It was the liturgical reform, which was aimed at essentially making all the clergy of the empire praying in the same fashion, to recall this concord and divine blessing. So it was also a very functional reason for this, theoretically. The second was the bettering of the clergy education, and especially of the knowledge of the language and the Latin language and grammar. And this was naturally aimed at to educate the people in the Christian message. Sometimes even the priests in pre-Carolingian times, and also for some time even afterwards, didn't absolutely understand Latin. If you read how they read the book in Bavaria, I don't know, in the 7th century, in the 8th century, was like, they completely didn't understand what they were reading, even linguistically speaking, not theologically speaking. So you can imagine what the situation was. This is also a very discriminant factor. I mean, the areas that had a low Romanization or no Romanization at all couldn't understand Latin at all, most of the times, unless they weren't educated formally in this way. Because in other countries, even like Gaul, obviously Italy, and partly other, Latin was, even vernacular was slowly differentiating from that. In Gaul, maybe not. In Gaul, it really depends, because in Gaul, especially also the northern France was not very Romanized. It was, at least in language, they were speaking a Romance language, was very, very different. In southern, not very, very different. It's still after Italian the closest, especially Britain, language to Latin that exists. French. But in southern France, it was much less differentiated. It also was in much closer contact with Italy, so also to the spring of the Romance languages and so on. The third point in the Carolingian policy had been the importance of writing in the administration, in law, in diplomacy. So this was very important because it was essentially the base of what the Romans did. Was there was the ideal of reinstating this kind of uniform administration and this huge empire that eventually the thing in part collapsed, but just think about even how Caroline script remained objectively and how written culture now was necessary to expand, also because the continent was slowly recovering from the contraction of early medieval times. That's actually a very important thing that uniformed the script into medieval Europe. Something that didn't exist before, because before every region kind of had its own script, so they didn't even understand what they wrote each other, even if they had written the same Latin at that point. So it's very interesting and a very important Carolingian legacy. And interestingly enough, also the Merovingians in the in the early times, especially when the first half of the 6th century, had tried to build a sort of more uniform education system for the administration that we're trying to build. Then eventually everything kind of collapsed. Also in there, the Gallo-Roman elites had been instrumental for doing this because they were the educated ones. But eventually the thing had basically ended with the disgregation of the Merovingian power. All these measures brought to also has Carolingian laws and dispositions in this sense show us to promote this comprehensive reorganizations of the educational system. So we're talking about all the levels, telling the truth, the highest ones, that is the one of the Carolingian court, that so the presence of some of the greatest European scholars at that time from all over Europe. Also the intermediate ranks of the functionaries, for instance, the missi. The Carolingians formed these missi dominici that were essentially a clergyman and a layman. Importantly enough, because the layman was mostly meant to be, the guy who bore arms and, control the situation with iron fist. The clergyman was the one who, kind of being more educated, literate, could deal with the local administration to check. They were checking each other, telling the shit, but also especially the clergy was much more favored by the Carolingians because they always feared that the missi, the laymen, the comites would kind of grow unfaithful because of decentralization. So the church especially participated to this centralization of the Carolingian Empire, that this attempt at least, out of which the same church came out very much strengthened, much more unified, much more robust in terms of administration and so on. Differently from the lay world, eventually kind of fragmented in all these lordships, the church kind of remained a bit more unitary, because also in there it was a bit complicated by the fact that of private foundations and so on, and also the fact that ultimately Carolingian clergy was drawn from the same lay aristocracy, so they were essentially the same people in part. But at least the church didn't have this problem that had to be split at every generation, and it's interesting. In terms of the inheritance, so that the monastery was also created as a monastic foundation, as a private foundation, because it hadn't to be split among the sons, but it was now belonging theoretically to the church. It was a way not to disperse the patrimony, very importantly. So that's where also many people from the lay world wanted the church to compact, because that could turn out to be quite useful. And this is what the Carolingians did with the church as well, and that's why, especially in countries like Germany and France, eventually for the future monarchies for monarchies were to develop in there, the church has always been so important, also politically speaking, because it was originally tied to this cooperation. This had more ancient roots in France and more new roots in Germany, but the results were pretty much the same. Probably in Germany, the church had even more importance in this sense, also a bit more of a competitive way, with the sovereign, albeit usually sticking together with it. While in France, it was institutionally a bit more framed since the beginning, but this is another point we can't digress. So this rebirth was definitely a very important movement because as a policy it brought to this very meaningful, significant increase in the European literacy at the time. However, also in here we have to look at it in perspective, as I said at the beginning, because while, indeed there was a qualitative growth of the, the expertise, the proficiency definitely of within, say, the frame of a determined context, a given context, but there was no proper breaking of the restrictions that existed also before in culture. I mean, also in here, the material in which these elites, cultural elites, intellectual elites, as you want to call them, were studying was also still limited. So it's more than else that this knowledge was put at the service of a different authority. It was paradoxically more, not necessarily more centralized, but more tied to the church in a political and administrative function. So even certain monarchical and royal ideologies were now being stressed by the church, was working for them in practice. And this is how all the successors of Charlemagne they moved on. Some of the same Carolingians, like Louis the Pious or Charles the Bald, were actually educated. There's this interesting progress also in the Carolingian dynasty itself. I mean, Pippin the Short, even Charlemagne had been largely ignorant people. I mean, Charlemagne represents the kind of the effort to get educated, because he felt also to give an example. He wanted to reform the whole empire to make it religiously, morally fit, and so on. So he had also to, through studying, through reading, through knowing Latin, and he was grown and educated in very different ways. But nevertheless, he spent all of his life trying to understand with his limited intellectual abilities, but however to make his best for learning, for understanding. Already Louis the Pious and Charles the Bald, so in the further generations, were already more educated, so you can see the effects of such a reform, let's call it in this way, also through the sovereigns that usually from that point onwards were, it's not that they were extremely educated. Indeed, if you take figures like, I don't know, Otto the Great, or these were ignorant people, but still there was the idea that, for instance, within the same royal family, there was someone who was destined to church education. For instance, Otto the first brother was quite actually one of the most educated men of his times. So also here there was a differentiation between laymen and the clergy that, however, unavoidably brought the same lay world to be kind of more aware of the potentials of education. Also, and especially for pragmatic reasons as well, too, chiefly political reasons, ideological reasons. We have seen in other videos how even the Ottonian times brought to a development of the imperial ideology. Also recollecting, looking back at the classical era, the imperial ideologies and so on. So having all this very, having a focus, having an agenda, realizing that culture, education, knowledge could be used to strengthen certain imperial prerogatives. And the creation of the empire was definitely very important, because with Carolingian times there was a reunification also of so many areas of Europe, and this need also for legitimizing the power in those lands was to uniform the administration as a whole. So this has naturally many had many consequences. And there is also another factor to take into consideration, that is the concentration of resources in the hands of fewer and fewer people with the development of the vassalatic beneficiary relations. Why is that? Because certain centers, like writing centers, like these monastic schools that we've seen now, were at the head not of the 6th century Benedictine monastery that was pretty much poor and so on. Now they were growing to be very rich centers. They were fiefs. They had lots of land, so people who worked for them. They even had military retinues. So they also had the chance to accumulate wealth, to buy, and actually buy it. Yeah, of course, also to buy, but also mostly to produce manuscripts. So this is the moment in which you see that these monastic schools, and even laymen, if you see a count like Everard of Friuli in northeastern Italy, he had actually a pretty remarkable asset of in books, in manuscripts, that he left as an inheritance to his sons, like a valuable good. But this idea is that the more resources you have concentrated, the more you can essentially specialize one center or another for this cultural, intellectual production, if you want. So there was also this idea of treasuring the books, of accumulating them, but never be tricked by this, because it was not. Many people think that, I don't know, in medieval times books were just buried into monastery libraries and that's it. Absolutely false. Since this very early Middle Ages, books circulated, and they circulated a lot. And monastic libraries were also often open to laymen. There was this awareness of the wealth of libraries. Some of them were amazing. When Petrarch went to Cologne, Petrarch, well, okay, we are in the 14th century, so it's a very different thing, but I'd say how certain cathedral libraries were so amazingly wealthy, also in very precious antique books. So not just monasteries, but also bishoprics and so on. The anecdote of Petrarch is basically, I think he was called at a council somewhere, and he took the chance to go to make an excursion to Cologne, and he went there and he found the library closed. The cathedral library closed, and he had to go away once again. So, but he knew from the guardian of the library that it was full of marvels in there, in terms of books. And naturally, Petrarch was a book hunter, so he was searching for all, especially all the classical texts and so on. But just for saying how much knowledge had accumulated in these centers over the centuries. But that's a completely different context now, because in the 14th century it was full of works about many other authors that at this time in the early Middle Ages didn't exist in Europe anymore, or they had been lost some way. However, there is also in here the hereditary nature of this. That is, from one side it's positive, because you see that the intellectual centers are kind of more aware, better defined, better organized, so they also exchange so much. These monasteries were all in contact with the other. But at the same time, this is still part of an elite. So paradoxically, compared to early medieval times, the laymen fell in literacy in post-Carolingian times. This is paradoxical because there is also an expansion in economy, in many things. So that's where, from in the high medieval times, also the literacy among the laymen would start expanding. But the political and social stratification of Carolingian Europe brings all those freemen that theoretically maybe could, were, especially in certain countries, well off enough to, I don't know, to get educated, maybe just a little bit, to start a business or something through the local parishes, now didn't have the time and wealth anymore to dedicate to that. They were progressively becoming serfs, not freemen anymore. as peasants, and and literacy falls also in post-Carolingian times. So it's very interesting that what are commonly thought as this derogatory term of the Dark Ages, actually these were instead a bit more, so a higher level of literacy seemingly than high medieval Europe in part. Then this is an approximation because every place should be studied on its own. This really largely depends. But let's say that feudalism brings to the idea that it's not much about egalitarianism that brings education, but a sort of structured society, a hierarchical society where it's just the elite that deals with the ideologies, with knowledge, and so on, and the rest has just to obey, because objectively they're framed into that hierarchy at the bottom of society, and they really don't have much options at that point. It was not even obviously education was still seen as a positive thing overall. It's just that society had been transformed in that way, and this was one of the major consequences. When the Ottonians went to Italy, for instance, they were impressed by the level of literacy that existed compared to Germany, and the clergy of Germany, the councillors of the Ottonians, were saying, take example from that, because that can be useful also in Germany, and let's try to do it. Obviously that couldn't be done so easily, so quickly, because there were major structural reasons because of these differences between the two countries. But nevertheless, it's important that from this time there was someone who always, at least in these times, that someone who always realized the importance and the potential of knowledge and culture, and knew how to use it in many ways. It goes without saying, however, that this overall was mostly a illiterate society, that writing culture remained substantially in the hands of the clergy, and this wouldn't change, especially for certain countries, for many centuries. So this naturally influenced enormously also the historiographical production, but it's still much less dramatic than it's commonly thought, and much more effervescent and dynamic than we can expect. Also, consider that in countries especially like France and Germany, that were less used to the Latin writing than the Mediterranean, vernacular was put on, was written down much earlier than other regions. In Italy, for instance, you have to wait for a long time for this to happen, because there was more continuity with Latin. There was this greater, this idea that this greater continuity in education and teaching. Latin was the written language. In countries like Germany and France, they immediately began to knowing how to write, to instinctively write simply the vernacular they felt. And this is very important because naturally it produced so many also vernacular sources that are very important to understand since an early age what the passage from the linguistical evolution has been about in those countries. And it tells us so much about the society in there. The problem of Latin is that if you don't come from a country that has always spoken that kind of Romance language, you don't feel it like your own. If you're a Germanic speaker, you're gonna stick to Germanic preferably. I mean, it's kind of evident, it's kind of natural. So this also has to do with many things of how that world is organized. It's never something culture in this sense is kind of epiphenomenal. It's just occupies great part of the surface. You have to look at the roots, at the depths, to understand how it practically really was under other points of view. So this is the always I think the best key of interpretation for such topics, and cannot be otherwise. So, alright, I think for today it's over, and so I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.